Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. We are a consortium of 75 groups in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Patrick Browne. Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Patrick Browne is the executive director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. He has extensive work in other historical societies on the South Shore. He also was the founding chairman of the Backroads of the South Shore, a consortium of historical museums on the South Shore, PhD from Boston University. Great to have you. And we're going to be talking about an event that very few of us know about, which is the almost Battle of Marshfield.
Yes. That's sort of what I've dubbed it. It easily could have worked out that the second battle of the Revolution might have been the Battle of Marshfield, but as circumstances turned out, it wasn't.
So, how did you first find out about it?
Well, I was executive director of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society for a long time, and the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society has a very extensive archival collection. Mm-hmm. And I well remember finding a document in the archives that really thrilled me. It was a 1775 payroll for a Duxbury militia company that served, and the dates of service were on there, April 19 to April 21 in Marshfield.
Wow.
And I thought, April 19 during the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and this Duxbury Minute Company is doing something in Marshfield. What's going on here? And so that got me into researching the event a little more, and it's just it's blossomed into a large research project.
Well, that's great. So what was happening in Marshfield on April 19th and 20th of 1775?
Well, it just so happens that Marshfield was the only town in Massachusetts outside of Boston that had a garrison of British regulars.
Wow.
The only occupied town outside of Boston. And of course, when Concord and Lexington happened, the militia and minute companies from towns all over the South Shore, they didn't head to Concord and Lexington. They headed to where the nearest Redcoats were, which, if you lived on the South Shore, that was Marshfield.
So why were there Redcoats in Marshfield?
That's a long story.
Hey, well, that's good.
We'll try to get into it. So it really is rooted in the fact that Marshfield had an unusually high proportion of loyalists prior to the war.
Okay.
And I think the question that immediately surfaces is why? What made Marshfield different? Loyalists were typically a minority in most Massachusetts towns. Certainly in South Shore towns like Duxbury and Plymouth, loyalists were quite a small minority. But in Marshfield, it seems that it was about 50-50.
Wow.
And the question comes why. And other historians have looked into this. I'm certainly not the first to dig into this story, but a Marshfield town historian back in the 70s came up with what I think is a very plausible theory, and that is that if you look at land grants in Marshfield going back to the 17th century, land grants of Plymouth Colony, the grants that were given out in Marshfield were unusually large, a different pattern than you saw in other South Shore towns. And so the theory is that these land grants, this pattern led to sort of a landed gentry, a strong, wealthy social class that wielded a great deal of economic and political power in that town. And so, yeah, you have sort of a different ruling class, if you will, in Marshfield, who tended to be loyalists as we got closer to the revolution.
Yeah, interesting. And there had been an episode with tea burning in Marshfield too.
Yes, and that's really where, this story sort of begins with the Tea Party, because it was the tensions coming out of that made loyalists in Marshfield very anxious. So just a few days after, according to one account, a few days after the Boston Tea Party, Marshfield patriots followed suit, and they held their own tea party. This did not involve throwing tea in a harbor, but it involved taking tea that was stored in the local ordinary or tavern and taking tea that had been stowed away in some other locations. And these Marshfield patriots got together, piled the tea crates up on a large boulder atop a hill near Marshfield Center, and they set that tea on fire.
Wow. Now, was this East India Company tea?
Yes. Okay. Yes, exactly. And so the date is a little unclear. One account gives and it's a secondary account, gives the date as December 19, 1773. So it'd be just 3 days after the Boston Tea Party. And the boulder on which they burned the tea came to be known as Tea Rock. And the hill on which the boulder stood came to be known as Tea Rock Hill. Okay. The boulder doesn't exist anymore, but Tea Rock Hill does, and that name is still attached to it. There's a Tea Rock Hill Lane. But I think very few people in Marshfield know why it's called Tea Rock Hill.
Interesting. So why are there Redcoats then in Marshfield? You said there are a lot of loyalists there, but did they ask for them, or they thought did someone think they needed them?
They did. So the loyalists, after this Marshfield Tea Party, held a town meeting because they felt the need to do a few things. They felt the need to, first off, declare Marshfield a loyalist town. They wanted to. During this town meeting, they passed several loyalist resolutions, declaring Marshfield a loyalist town, saying that the tea that was destroyed should be paid for, that the perpetrators should be punished, basically asserting we are loyal followers of the king. They also, interestingly enough, included in the resolutions a condemnation against the patriots of Plymouth, who they felt were unfairly threatening and terrorizing loyalists in Plymouth. So it's clear that the loyalists in Marshfield are nervous. They are worried about their safety and trying to assert their loyalism.
Yeah, interesting.
It got quite a bit worse in the summer of 1774. And this is with the Massachusetts Government Act and all the tension that came with that. I should mention that the individual in Marshfield who was the leading loyalist and played a very large role in all these events. His name was Nathaniel Ray Thomas, a leading Tory in Marshfield. And, when we ask the question of why did all this happen in Marshfield, the number of loyalists is certainly the main factor, but I also think that the character of Nathaniel Ray Thomas is another key factor, because he was bold, and assertive, and I think really wanted to assert his dominance over the town.
Sounds like the kind of guy that General Gage would appoint to the Mandamus Council.
That's exactly what happened. And he is he's appointed to the council, and of course, as you well know, and your listeners probably well know, there were probably no more hated men in the
Mhm.
province of Massachusetts Bay than those who accepted a
Mhm.
position onto the Mandamus Council. And eventually, a great mob came for Nathaniel Ray Thomas. This was on September 7, 1774. And the people of Plymouth gathered at dawn. Apparently, there was a prearranged plan to do this. We get this from Dr. Thatcher's history, and he would have known firsthand from people who saw these events. People of Plymouth gathered at dawn to go convince Nathaniel Ray Thomas to resign. And so a large number of people from Plymouth marched to Marshfield. These are citizens.
Yeah.
But as they go through Kingston, Duxbury, they're joined by groups from those towns. They're joined by groups from Hanover and Scituate and other places. And one period account of this event describes them, this mass of the people going to visit Nathaniel Ray Thomas, as marching in battalia.
Wow.
And it makes me wonder, is that just an expression that this letter writer was using, or did we actually have militia mixed in here? I think there may have been some
probably because you do see that in other places where this happens, that it is the militia turning up. Now, had Thomas served in office before?
He had served local offices.
Okay.
He had not served. I'm not aware of him serving any provincial office.
Yeah, but he was a well-known figure in the town and one of the leaders in the town, apparently.
Yes. Yeah. And when that mob came for him, one period account, this is a contemporary letter, describes the number as being about 2,000.
Wow.
Now, should we take that with a grain of salt? Maybe, but if 2,000 people show up outside your house,
right? Yeah,
that's a little intimidating.
It is.
And it so happened that Nathaniel Ray Thomas had fled. He was already gone.
Wow.
The representatives knock on his door, and his wife answered and said, well, he left last night. He's in Boston. And they found a justice of the peace and made her swear on a Bible that Nathaniel Ray Thomas wasn't there. This is where I kind of fill in the story with my imagination a little bit. And I wonder, when Nathaniel Ray Thomas got to Boston, what was the first thing he did when he got to Boston? He must have been banging on Governor Gage's door, saying, these people on the South Shore are out of their minds. They're coming to hang us all. We need a detachment of troops in Marshfield. I have no evidence that he said this, but he must have. I mean, he must.
That's interesting. Wow. Yeah. So Marshfield. Do you know of other loyalists then leaving as well? And does Mrs. Thomas stay after this?
So Nathaniel Ray Thomas would be back, but yes, other Marshfield loyalists did leave. Another leading one, Abijah White, who had been very vocal in criticizing the Boston Tea Party. He went to Boston at this time, and several others would. But Nathaniel Ray Thomas came back when the Redcoat, we're not exactly sure precisely when, but the Redcoats were stationed in Marshfield on January 23, 1775.
Okay.
And they landed at the North River and marched through town. And where did they set up their barracks? At the Nathaniel Ray Thomas estate, of course. So it was a company of about 100 Redcoats. led by an officer, Captain Nesbitt Balfour, who would go on to have a very successful military and political career. But this 100-man garrison brought with them 2 cannon and 300 muskets.
Wow.
Used by the loyalists of Marshfield.
Okay. So it's not just these 100 troops, but they also have support from the loyal citizens of Marshfield.
In theory,
Okay.
that's the rub, is that for the Patriots, who would eventually go to confront this garrison, or nearly confront this garrison, that must have been a big question in their minds. How many loyalists are going to turn out under arms?
Right.
Are we going to be facing 100 Redcoats and 300 loyalists, 500 loyalists, maybe more? That was a big question.
Of course, it's also then a question for the loyalists. Do they want to take up arms against their neighbors?
Exactly.
That's. We're talking with Patrick Browne, who is the executive director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. And in addition to the work he does in Plymouth, he has been working on researching the almost Battle of Marshfield in April of 1775. So how do these various militia groups from the South Shore learn that there's been this battle at Lexington and Concord, and then what they do in response?
Yeah. So we know that word reached Plymouth about Concord and Lexington sometime in the afternoon of April 19.
Wow.
That a rider arrived with the news. It was probably early afternoon. And the commanding officer of the 1st Plymouth County Regiment was a man named Colonel Theophilus Cotton. So he is the leading commanding officer in the area, and he sends out the call to muster. So his regiment begins to muster. This involves companies from Plymouth, Kingston, Duxbury, and other places. There was a 2nd Plymouth County Regiment that was commanded by a Marshfield man, actually, Colonel Anthony Thomas.
Was he any relation to Nathaniel Ray Thomas?
That's a great question. I believe that they are distant cousins.
Wow.
But not a close relation.
Okay. And then I also wonder, because John Thomas is from Kingston, the General Thomas.
So John Thomas, I may need a fact check on this, but I am fairly sure that General John Thomas of Kingston is the brother of Colonel Anthony Thomas.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So both, members of this Thomas family, but on the Patriot side.
Okay.
And so Marshfield Patriot companies begin gathering at the Colonel Anthony Thomas house, which is about 2 miles from Nathaniel Ray Thomas's house. Companies start converging from around the region, and April 19th, nothing happens.
Wow.
Yeah. Colonel Theophilus Cotton on April 20th decides to hold a council of war. He gathers his officers. And according to, I think, a reliable 19th century historian, this council of war took place at the home of Lieutenant Colonel Briggs Alden, who was Theophilus Cotton's second in command.
Okay.
And so Cotton meets there with his officers and the captains of some of the various companies that are gathering in the area. And essentially, the question is, do we attack the Marshfield garrison, or or what? What's the plan of action here?
Right.
Estimating based on the companies that I have read about that were on hand at that time, I think Theophilus Cotton had maybe 200 men on April 20, maybe a little more. So let's say 200 to 300, but against 100 Redcoats who had 2 cannon, and who knows how many loyalists.
Right. Yeah.
So I cannot blame Theophilus Cotton on April 20 for saying, let's wait another day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he well knew that in one more day, companies would be coming from the inland towns, Hampton, Halifax, Middleborough. Companies would be coming from as far as Barnstable. They were on the way.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So on April 20, they do nothing. Meanwhile, Boston, General Gage gets word of what's going on here in Marshfield. Of course, General Gage has his hands pretty well full right now.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But he gets word and immediately orders, he says, with all haste, he orders Admiral Graves to send another vessel and to commandeer an additional 2 vessels to Marshfield to pick up this garrison.
So he's not going to send reinforcements. He's going to get them out.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Interesting.
And his letter expressly mentions that they should also be picking up the loyal inhabitants of Marshfield. Okay. So people like Nathaniel Ray Thomas and others.
Wow.
So the garrison in Marshfield is very soon going to be picked up off of Grant Rock, and they will be gone. But Colonel Theophilus Cotton does not know this.
No.
And so we come to April 21st, and Cotton finally decides to advance his regiment to Marshfield to meet up with all these other companies, and probably 500 strong now. They march to within close distance of the Nathaniel Ray Thomas estate. And they halt and wait. And there is a story that one company commander, Captain Peleg Wadsworth of Kingston, grew so annoyed with the stalling and delay that without orders, he advanced his Kingston company to the firing range of Nathaniel Ray Thomas's house. And that's when they discovered that the Redcoats were gone.
Oh, wow. So they'd already left.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're talking with Patrick Browne, the executive director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. And Jonathan reminds us that you are correct, that Colonel Anthony Thomas and General John Thomas were brothers.
Yeah,
so then also just both distantly related to Nathaniel Ray Thomas, who is now had Nathaniel Ray Thomas and the other loyalists also left at this point?
Yeah, Nathaniel Ray Thomas left with the British garrison on that day. And other leading loyalists also left. Apparently, quite a few civilians. Now, these were usually the male heads of household who left because they were the ones that the mob was going to come for. The wives and children were typically left behind.
Yeah,
and that indeed was the case with Nathaniel Ray Thomas's family. Although eventually his family would join him in Boston, and then later, after evacuation day, Nathaniel Ray Thomas and his family would go with British forces to Nova Scotia.
Interesting.
That's where Nathaniel Ray Thomas lived out the rest of his life, in Nova Scotia.
Well, so never came back to Marshfield.
No.
Okay. I mean, it does. I mean, the story you've told us does raise this question, because Theophilus Cotton doesn't know what these guys are doing, and Gage probably has a better sense of what's happening, but for the rest of the province, how do we know we're at war, and what does this mean?
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I can't, some people have sort of, Monday morning quarterbacked this and faulted Colonel Cotton for not being more aggressive. But I can't fault him for a moment. I mean, these companies from Plymouth County, they had not witnessed Lexington. They had not witnessed Concord. They had heard about it, but they really didn't know quite exactly what was going on. And, I think that for Cotton, there was a really difficult question of, are we at war? Is this really when we start shooting? Is this truly happening right now? And so I cannot blame him at all for his caution there.
Yeah. Paul Revere mentions in Boston these watchers, that is, people watching the movements of each side. This is how he knows that he's alert to the fact the British are moving out. I wonder if there's anything similar that you found in Marshfield with this relatively small group of troops. They must have been under observation from people in the area.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, in Plymouth, there were some fears that Balfour intended to independently, this is before Concord and Lexington, that Balfour maybe intended to move his company to Plymouth.
Interesting.
And try to subdue rebellious Plymouth with this company. So there were considerable fears that this company might move. I haven't read any direct accounts of patrols or anything of that sort, but they must have been keeping an eye on this garrison. They absolutely must have been.
As you said, the town is about 50-50 in its loyalties, so there would have been, and so with the exodus of loyalists, I guess that equation changes in Marshfield.
Oh yes, after April 19, it becomes very much a town dominated by patriots because the leading loyalists have all left.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. I wonder, Patrick, if we could talk a little bit about Plymouth, which is much there. Winslow, and I know Hutchinson's son's one of the tea merchants. He goes to Plymouth, where his wife is from, and he actually gets kicked out. Plymouth or the neighboring town. But then Plymouth does have more going on, and I know that the Plymouth Antiquarian Society is doing a bit to commemorate these events. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what Plymouth is doing, or what you were doing at the Plymouth Antiquarian Society to commemorate the beginnings of the Revolution.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, Plymouth had its own tensions, to be sure. I mean, it was, as I said, loyalists were a minority in Plymouth, but there were some very outspoken loyalists, and Plymouth had its difficulties and had to appoint committees to figure out what to do about these loyalists who insisted on selling tea.
Right.
In Plymouth, they refused to stop selling the East India Company tea, and this vexed many people in Plymouth. Initially, they dealt with these loyalists in a very civil manner. They would have them come before the committee, and it was almost like a trial. But certainly a good deal of tension involved. Eventually, after the Massachusetts Government Act and the appointment of the Mandamus Council, things in Plymouth, like other towns, got. I mean, you had houses of loyalists in Plymouth being ransacked.
Right.
And so, Plymouth has its own history of this conflict and tension going on.
It does. And I know the Marshfield events are being commemorated actually on Patriots Day, April 21st.
Yes.
And in Plymouth, you have something on April 26th, I think, a commemoration with
We do. We have a few things coming up in
That's great.
Plymouth, which I'll mention real quick, if I may. And you mentioned April 26th. That is the date of the South Shore History Symposium, which is produced by a group called Backroads of the South Shore.
Mhm.
And that is a consortium of South Shore historical organizations. And so on April 26th, we are going to be having a morning of presentations. And of course, the whole theme is the South Shore during the
Right.
Revolution. For all of these events that I mentioned, by the way, you can go to PlymouthAntiquarian.org/events, and you can register for the South Shore History Symposium and other events. On the afternoon of April 26th, we're having an event at our Spooner House Museum on North Street that is called Liberty and Tea. And it will be an opportunity not only to sample the varieties of tea that were actually dumped in Plymouth Harbor, not Plymouth, Boston Harbor.
Boston Harbor, okay.
For the
or burned on the tea rock in Marshfield.
Tea rock, exactly. But also to sample a Liberty tea and herbal tea that the colonists drank in protest.
Wow.
And we are going to have what I'm calling a pop-up exhibit at the Spooner House. This is April 26, 2 p.m. at the Spooner House. And this pop-up exhibit will feature some rarely shown objects from the collections of Plymouth Antiquarian Society related to the Revolution, including, I might add, a wonderful object that is the waistcoat of General James Warren from Plymouth.
Okay.
And that's Mercy Otis Warren's husband.
Yes.
We also have a shoe belonging to Mercy Otis Warren. Why just one shoe? I don't know. I don't know where the other one went.
Wow.
We never had it. I know we were only given one shoe. So that's April 26th. If I can quickly throw in two other events.
Please do.
On May 13, Plymouth Antiquarian Society at our Hedge House Museum. May 13, 2 p.m., we will be having a parlor talk and a exhibit of Revolutionary War era clothing, of which we have a very great deal. And I really want to emphasize the fact that the Plymouth Antiquarian Society has a tremendous collection of wonderful historic clothing.
Wow.
And we are currently undertaking a massive project, an inventory reconciliation.
Interesting.
To, figure out how to better store, better exhibit, and better understand our massive historic clothing.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
So some great pieces from that collection are going to be exhibited on May 13, and we'll have some wonderful professional clothing conservators who are going to talk about these wonderful examples of historic clothing that will be on display.
Great. You mentioned the Spooner House Museum and the Hedge House Museum. I wonder, how many museums do you have in the Plymouth Antiquarian Society?
A good question. We have three.
Okay.
And we like to say we have one from each century, although not the 20th century.
Okay.
So we have a 17th century house, that is the Harlow Old Fort House, dates to 1677. We have the Spooner House, and that is on Sandwich Street in Plymouth. We have the Spooner House, which dates to 1740s. And that is 27 North Street in Plymouth. And lastly, we have the Hedge House, which is 1809, and that is on Water Street in Plymouth.
Wow.
Yes. And if I can throw in just one last event, on May 17, that's a Saturday at 3 p.m., in collaboration with the Mercy Otis Warren Society, which is a new group and a wonderful group promoting the history of Mercy Otis Warren. We are going to be producing a short play at the 1749 courthouse called Revolutionary Voices, Plymouth Debates, Liberty, and Loyalty. And the objective here is to, it's sort of a what if you were in the room where the Plymouth Committee of Correspondence debated. And of course, this is the group that is assigned to not only correspond with Boston in times of crisis, but sort of set policy for the town of Plymouth in many ways. If you could be in that room when they were debating these issues, these leading up to the revolution, what might that have sounded like?
Right.
How might that debate have gone? And so I've written a short play about it, and we'll be performing it with members of the Mercy Otis Warren Society. And I think that's going to be a very fun event.
Did you say you've written the play?
I did, yeah.
Wow, you're too modest. The last thing you mentioned is this play you wrote that's being performed on May 17th at the courthouse. Actually, Peter Oliver, I believe, built the courthouse, and then as part of the whole resistance, the rock was moved up to the front of it.
Exactly. And what's really sort of fun about the setting, the 1749 courthouse where we will be performing this is where a lot of these committees actually met. Right. Where the town meeting certainly met. Right. And so we're performing this dramatization in the place where it actually happens.
It's amazing. So that's great. It should be fun. And Jonathan reminds me that you've also done a study of Civil War monuments in Massachusetts. You are really a Civil War historian in addition to overseeing the Plymouth Antiquarian Society.
Yeah, listening to me today, you might think that I was a Rev War historian.
Yeah, you're doing a great job.
my main field of study is Civil War, but I am thoroughly enjoying immersing myself in the Revolutionary War history of Plymouth and the South Shore for this 250th event. It reminds me of when I was a kid growing up in Acton. And marching along the Isaac Davis Trail on Patriots Day. That's sort of what got me started on history. So.
This is great. It's great. Well, thank you for what you're doing to spark others' interest in this history.
Thank you very much.
And Acton 250 is doing great work. So it's
yes, indeed.
Yeah. So are you. So thank you so much. We've been talking with Patrick Browne, who is the executive director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. Although we mainly talked about Marshfield, there's lots happening in Plymouth, and we're really glad that you are leading the charge.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Has been. And I want to thank our man behind the curtain, Jonathan Lane, who has been keeping things moving, and he's very busy this month with things happening all over Massachusetts to commemorate the beginnings of the Revolution. And I also want to thank our listeners around the country, around the world, who are tuning in regularly. Every week we thank folks who are. And if you want to connect with Jonathan, or if you're in one of these places and want some of our Rev 250 swag, send him an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, shout out to our friends in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, here in Massachusetts, in Woburn, Revere, and Orleans, and in Copenhagen, Frankfurt, Amman, Edinburgh, and Tel Aviv, Delhi, New York, Helena, Montana, Detroit, Michigan, Huntington, West Virginia, Lutz, Pensacola, and Tallahassee in the great state of Florida, and in Magnolia, Texas, and McLean, Virginia. Thank you all, and all places between and beyond. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.